Hello and welcome. I'm Meron Khalili. We are DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is our regular live coordinating call. And today we're going to talk about, once again, Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Yes, the war is grinding on. As of yesterday, the UN estimates that 925 civilians have been killed, 1,500 injured, 3.5 million, mainly women and children and the elderly, have fled their country as refugees, and many more are trying to get out. 6.5 million people displaced within the country, whole city blocks flattened, including a children's hospital, a maternity hospital. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, and yet it could all get so much worse. So whatever we say here today, let's be clear that Putin's illegal invasion is horrific, and we should all stand with the Ukrainian people. War is hell. Thank you for watching, and let's jump straight into it. Yanis, you first.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, those of you who are watching. What I want to talk about today is a very painful criticism waged against me personally, but not just me, against Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, various comrades of DiEM25, and broadly of the progressive community of the world, of the progressive international. Criticism that has come from Eastern Europe, from progressives in Eastern Europe, who are taking exception at our scrutiny of the role of NATO, of the fact that we say neither Putin nor NATO. And the particular accusation, which, as I said, I'm being honest with our audience, is very painful personally, is the accusation of westsplaining, which of course comes from mansplaining. And to be precise, we all know what mansplaining means: the tendency of men to explain to women the circumstances of their own oppression by men. This translates into the discourse regarding Eastern Europe as follows: that we Western left-wingers and liberals condescend to explain Eastern Europe to Eastern Europeans and to explain to them their predicament. This is the accusation. Now, if this accusation is valid, and it has to be taken very seriously amongst comrades, we have something very serious to contend with. Now, let me try to do justice to this complaint, to this accusation that we Western left-wingers, the people I mentioned, DiEM25, the Progressive International, are disrespecting Eastern European progressives by telling them, explaining to them their own predicament and denying them agency effectively. This is the accusation. Now, there is no doubt that those of us who grew up in a country like mine in the West, and those who grew up in Poland, the Czech Republic, what used to be Czechoslovakia, and so on, that we have different oppressions, historic oppressions, to draw lessons from, and to develop different sensitivities and sensibilities. For instance, I grew up as a young kid in a fascist dictatorship that was sponsored by NATO. My comrades in Poland suffered under a dictatorship sponsored by the Soviet Union, or by Russians in particular. And they have a very long tradition of their country being torn apart by various Russian regimes, not just the Soviet Union. And therefore, this is not to be contested. This is something I accept totally. It is natural that we Greeks, for instance, tend to be more critical of NATO, whereas the criticisms of our comrades in Poland and Eastern Europe and Ukraine, of course, is far more directed towards Moscow. This is legitimate, and therefore our criticisms of NATO to them seem like being out of place. Their main critique of our position is that we are challenging the right of Eastern Europeans to choose NATO. It's been in black and white in various articles that have been blaming DiEM, Progressive International, and me personally, and Noam Chomsky and all our comrades, for having missed out an important fact, and that is that majorities in their countries, in Poland, in the Ukraine, in Czech Republic, and so on, supported their country's entry into NATO. Therefore, their entry was democratically legitimized. Therefore, who are we to simply talk about NATO expanding as if it was something that NATO did against the peoples of Eastern Europe? Yes, there is no doubt that, this is me speaking now, right, that it is significant that majorities wanted to enter NATO, for instance, in Poland. But this does not mean, comrades, that I, as a Greek left-winger, should agree with NATO expansion just because a majority in Poland consented to it. And there's nothing condescending about this. I often oppose tooth and nail views and decisions favored by a majority of Greeks. Let's say that there is an opinion poll taken here in Greece with a majority wanting NATO. It doesn't stop me from rejecting that or arguing that, yes, of course, the majority may want that. But I am not in favor of this. And I think that the majority of Greeks are mistaken. Now, should somebody say to me that I can say this about my own compatriots, but I can't say this about the Poles, then I will say that, hang on a second, this violates basic principles of internationalism. The whole point of DiEM25 is that we are in this collective together, not as Greeks or Poles or Italians or whatever. We are here as Europeans, as citizens, and we have every right to criticize majority views in our countries, in neighboring countries, in every country. That, for me, is internationalism. Now, the hypothesis of our critics who are accusing us of westsplaining, they have a very interesting point they make. They say, you guys are telling us that deeper cause of the conflict in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova, in all the places where there are Russian troops or paramilitaries, we are telling them, that it's because NATO violated the agreement between the United States and Gorbachev, initially Yeltsin afterwards, and NATO expanded. And they tell us, the people who are accusing us of westsplaining, that, you know what, we have another hypothesis. Our hypothesis, their hypothesis, that Russia would have invaded Ukraine, Georgia, maybe even Poland, if NATO had not expanded. So it's, our hypothesis versus yours. Well, fine, we can disagree. Like all counterfactuals, what would have happened if NATO had not expanded? Would Russia have invaded the Ukraine? Like all counterfactuals, it's an untestable hypothesis. Okay, but let's establish amongst comrades who disagree that there are two hypotheses. There is the hypothesis that Russia would have invaded anyway if NATO had not acted in an expansionary imperialistic form. And there is my counter hypothesis that Putin would not have been in power today had the United States not actively kept Russia at bay. For instance, what would have happened if Russia's early request, and there was an official early request by Russia in the 1990s to have been admitted to NATO, once NATO didn't seem to be dissolving, what would have happened if Russia had been admitted to NATO? I think that the whole setup would have been very, very different. Washington was trying to keep Russia out and was trying to provoke the creation of a nasty regime in Moscow. That's my hypothesis. I may be wrong. My comrades in Poland, in Eastern Europe, who are accusing me of westsplaining may be right. But mutual respect between comrades means interrogating each other's argument, not othering the other side by labeling me as a westsplainer. In the same way, it would be awful for me to label them something. It's uncommonly of them to label me, you, Chomsky, and so on. Let's have an argument. Let's have a debate. But this kind of othering is absolutely detrimental to the very principles of internationalism. Now, I will conclude by moving on to the substance of things. Let's be clear here. What is the stake? I mean, people are dying as we speak in Mariupol, in Kiev, across the east and the south of the Ukraine. The label westsplainer was attached to people like myself for having advocated the independent, neutral Ukraine solution in juxtaposition to a Ukraine that's sticking to its aspiration for NATO membership. Now, this is really very serious, comrades, because it goes well beyond a complaint of us not taking the Ukrainians' agency seriously. By dismissing the neutrality solution, which I have advocated, and for which I have been called a westsplainer, by dismissing it, as something a westsplainer would opt for, what those comrades are declaring is a willingness, in a sense, to carry on the war in the name of some theoretical right to join NATO. That is a very significant decision they're making. Now, we left-wingers, everywhere in the world, we should understand above all else that there is a dialectic relationship between authoritarianisms. I am stating my position on this. Putin needs the Nazis of Ukraine, the Azov battalion, who are definitely Nazis. That's not an excuse for Putin to invade, but to deny that the Azov battalion are Nazis is to deny reality, truth. But what I'm saying is that he needs those Nazis, and those Nazis need Putin. Like we've always said, that the nationalists the ultra-nationalists, the neo-fascists in Europe needed the establishment, the Macrons and the Merkels and the Scholzes and so on, and the establishment needs the ultra-nationalists. I think that it is incumbent upon left-wingers to understand this dialectic relation. NATO justifies its existence as a supplier of security because of the insecurity it helped breed through its expansion that gives Putin the reason to be. Now, that I believe is a very solid left-wing Marxist dialectical position. I may be wrong, but I would like those who are labeling me and us westsplainers to respond to that. Now, one other accusation is that we are taking an equidistant position, Putin on one side, NATO on the other. Under no circumstances are we taking equidistant positions. We are saying unequivocally, and Meron, thank you for beginning this call by saying this, that Putin is the man and the leader responsible for the massacre of Ukrainians. He cannot blame NATO. Nobody can blame NATO for the invasion. He chose to invade. He didn't have to invade. What we're saying is, we are adding to this analysis that NATO created the circumstances for somebody like Putin to be where he is and to do what he does. That's not an equidistant position. Today we stand with Ukraine. We condemn Putin for a war he chose, which he could have chosen not to have, regardless of what NATO did or did not do. And that does not mean that we rush into NATO's bosom or that we turn a blind eye to NATO's contribution to building Putin up. Eastern Europe, as far as I'm concerned, will only be safe once all the authoritarians, all the autocrats are removed. The racist autocrats from Russia, from Poland, from Hungary, the Azov battalion in the Ukraine, and NATO, let's be clear, will not achieve this because NATO has gone into bed with most of those ultra-right-wing racists. Lastly, and this is how I'm finishing, comrades, the left, let's not forget, we have a very long tradition of being mortally wounded and mortally split by imperialist wars. The Second Communist International was split as a result of the Great War. Some socialists, social democrats, especially in Germany, took the side of their nation state. Similarly, on the other side, that caused us to split between those who took sides in an imperialist war and those who said, no, we're not taking sides. We have never really recovered from this split of the Second International. We must not repeat this, but unfortunately, it's already being repeated. Let's start with a very simple idea. Let's not call each other names. Thank you, Maren.